In 1935, Washington created Social Security and left roughly half of America's workers outside the gate. Farm laborers were out. Domestic servants working in private homes were out. The self-employed were out. So were many people working for government, nonprofit institutions, and in several other kinds of employment. This did not mean half the population was rejected at a government counter. It meant that the new federal old age insurance program recognized some jobs as covered employment and ignored others. Two Americans could work just as hard, earn money in the same town, and grow old under completely different rules. One worker's pay would begin building a federal insurance record. The other worker's pay would leave no trace in that system at all. The scale was enormous. A modern Congressional Research Service estimate puts the original coverage at about 56% of the workforce. Slightly more than half were in, about half were not. And that was only the first surprise. When money began leaving the system, the first reported benefit was not a pension. It was a one-time payment of 17 cents. Congress then rewrote the program before anyone received a recurring monthly check. And it took another 15 years before a major expansion brought millions of the excluded workers inside. The familiar story of Social Security begins with Franklin Roosevelt signing a law. But a signature does not explain how a national promise could start with such a large boundary. To understand that, we have to follow something less dramatic than a speech and more powerful than a slogan: the wage record. Social Security was designed as insurance earned through covered work. That required the federal government to know who had worked, who had employed them, how much they had been paid, and whether the right taxes had been collected. In a factory with a payroll office, those questions could be answered on paper. In a farmhouse, a private kitchen, or a series of temporary jobs paid partly in meals or lodging, they could be much harder. So the first program was built around the labor the government believed it could reliably see. That choice made a national system possible. It also made millions of real workers invisible. The history of early Social Security is the history of that gate. Why it was drawn, who stood outside it, what happened when the first strange payments exposed the limits of the design, and how the line moved without ever becoming as simple as the word universal. Growing old in America before Social Security did not mean there was literally no support. It meant there was no dependable national floor. An older person might live on savings. A former employee might receive a private pension. A family might take in a parent or grandparent. A charity might help. Some states offered old age assistance. Many people simply kept working for as long as their bodies allowed. But each of those arrangements could fail. Private pensions reached only a narrow part of the workforce. Social Security's own historical account estimates that in 1932, only about 15% of the labor force even had potential employment-related pension coverage. Only about 5% of older people actually received a retirement pension. State assistance was just as uneven. By 1935, 30 states had some form of old age pension law. Yet only about 3% of older Americans received benefits under those programs, and the average payment was roughly 65 cents a day. Eligibility rules varied. Local budgets varied. Need could be treated less like a social risk than a personal failure. The Depression turned every weakness in that patchwork into a crisis. Savings disappeared with banks and markets. Adult children lost jobs of their own. Property values collapsed. An older worker who had expected family support could find the whole household depending on one uncertain wage. The Federal Committee on Economic Security estimated in 1935 that at least half of the roughly 7.5 million Americans over 65 were dependent. Much of their support came from children, friends, and relatives who were themselves living through mass unemployment. This was the political force behind the Social Security Act. But the law did not offer one answer to old age. It offered two. The first was immediate assistance. Title I allowed federal matching money to support state programs for people who were already old and needy. These benefits were based on need. A person did not have to spend years paying a federal payroll tax before help could begin. The second answer was old age insurance under Title II. That system looked forward. Workers and employers would pay taxes on covered wages. The government would maintain a record. After retirement, qualified workers would receive benefits linked to that record. The distinction mattered. A person already old in 1935 could not wait years to build an insurance history. A younger worker could. Assistance answered the emergency in front of the government. Insurance tried to prevent the next generation from reaching old age with no enforceable claim. This is where the first gate appeared. Assistance depended on age, need, and state administration. Insurance depended on covered employment. The law could announce old age security in broad language, but the insurance machine still needed a precise answer to a narrow question. Which work counted? Franklin Roosevelt signed the Social Security Act on August 14, 1935. The signing photograph makes the moment look complete. The president at a desk, lawmakers gathered around him, a national program born in ink. The actual statute was less tidy. It covered far more than retirement. It created old age assistance, an unemployment compensation structure, aid to dependent children, and other welfare and public health programs. And inside the old age insurance provisions, it built both a tax system and a list of exceptions. The taxes were scheduled to begin in January 1937. Employees would pay 1% of covered wages, and employers would pay another 1%, up to $3,000 of wages per employer. The first monthly old age benefits, however, were not scheduled to begin until January 1942. That 5-year gap was intentional. The original system would collect money, build records, and allow workers to accumulate credit before monthly pensions began. Then came Section 811. Its exclusions were written not as a list of people who did not deserve protection, but as kinds of employment outside the statutory definition. Agricultural labor was excluded. Domestic service in a private home was excluded. Casual labor outside the employer's normal business was excluded. Under the original definition, the list also included service performed after age 65, specified maritime work, federal employment, state and local government employment, and work for qualifying religious, charitable, scientific, literary, or educational nonprofit organizations. Self-employed people were outside by the structure of the law itself. The system defined employment through service performed by an employee for an employer. If there was no employer in that legal relationship, there was no covered payroll for the new insurance program to tax and record. Railroad workers were handled through a separate retirement arrangement. These categories did not all come from one argument. Government workers raised questions about federal and state systems and constitutional boundaries. Nonprofit work raised another set of legal and political concerns. Railroad employment already had its own institutional path. Work after 65 sat awkwardly beside the idea of retirement insurance. But agricultural and domestic labor were the largest and most consequential exclusions. Farms were scattered. Employment could be seasonal. Compensation might include housing, meals, or other non-cash maintenance. Domestic work happened behind the doors of private homes, often with one household employing one person. Regular payroll ledgers could be absent. Employers could be difficult to identify, educate, and audit. The program's designers were not merely promising checks. They were promising to calculate future entitlements from a lifetime of wages. If the record was incomplete, the promise could not be administered as written. That was the logic behind the line. It was also the source of its injustice. The work that was easiest for the state to record became the work that could earn a federal insurance right. The work that was hardest to record became the work that disappeared from the program. The people outside the first coverage line were not a random half of the workforce. Industrial and commercial payrolls were relatively legible. A factory, department store, or large office could list employees, report wages, withhold a tax, and send records through a regular accounting system. The federal government could point to an employer and demand a return. Agricultural and domestic labor looked different on paper. A farm worker might move between employers with the season. A household employee might work for several families. Wages could be irregular or partly in kind. A very small employer might never have maintained the records that the insurance system now required. The administrative problem was real. It was not, however, neutral in its effects. The occupational structure of the United States had been shaped by race, region, gender, and decades of unequal access to land and jobs. An official Social Security historical study, using 1930 census categories, estimated that about 65% of gainfully employed African Americans worked in agriculture or domestic and personal service. For white workers, the comparable share was about 27%. The statute never said that black workers as a group were barred. Black workers in covered factories, offices, and other commerce could participate. Many white farm and domestic workers were excluded. Most people outside those two categories in raw numbers were white. But the impact was unmistakably unequal. When coverage was drawn around occupations, the country's existing occupational segregation entered the program with it. A rule could be written without a racial label and still fall much more heavily on black workers. A rule could be written without naming women and still exclude huge numbers of women working in private homes. Historians continue to argue about how much racial politics explains the exclusions. The clearest surviving administrative record emphasizes collection and record-keeping. Staff working on the program recommended postponing farm and domestic coverage because they believed it could not yet be enforced reliably. Francis Perkins and Harry Hopkins pushed toward broader coverage. Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau warned Congress that the Bureau of Internal Revenue could not effectively collect from the proposed categories. The narrower definition was adopted with little recorded debate. That sequence does not prove that prejudice was absent from the politics of the New Deal. It also does not support a simple story in which one recorded bargain explicitly banned Black Americans from Social Security. Motive and effect are different claims. The documentary case for administrative difficulty is strong. The documentary case for unequal impact is equally strong. The result can be seen without reducing the law to a single villain. Imagine two workers in the same year. One feeds steel through a mill and receives a recorded wage from a company payroll. The other harvests crops, cleans a private home, or takes in laundry for several households. Both produce value. Both grow older. Only one begins accumulating covered wages. The gate did not measure effort. It measured whether labor fit the reporting system Congress was willing and able to build. Before the government could pay a monthly benefit, it had to create a national memory. Nothing on this scale existed. The new Social Security Board had no mature network of field offices. It needed to register tens of millions of workers, assign each one a unique number, receive wage reports from employers, and preserve those reports for decades. The post office became the front line. Applications moved through local post offices because postal workers already reached communities across the country. Forms were gathered, checked, and sent into a new administrative chain. Typing centers copied information. Records traveled to Baltimore. Names and numbers entered numerical files and punch card machinery. Roughly 30 million applications were processed during the initial registration. That number explains both the ambition of the program and the fear behind the exclusions. A single mistaken digit could separate a wage from a worker. A missing employer report could erase months of contribution history. Years later, that invisible clerical gap could become a smaller benefit, or a claim the worker could not prove. The government was not only collecting money, it was trying to maintain a correct lifetime ledger for a workforce larger than the population of many nations. The Social Security number was the key to that ledger. It was not originally designed as a universal national identity card. Its essential job was to connect reported wages to one account so that future benefit rights could be calculated. For covered employees, the machine began operating in January 1937. A payroll tax appeared in the envelope. The employer sent a matching tax. The wage entered a record. For an excluded worker, none of that happened. The absence could look like freedom from a new tax in the present. It also meant no insured claim was accumulating for the future. Being outside was not simply receiving less. It meant the relationship between work and federal protection did not exist. And the government built this system before it knew whether the Supreme Court would allow it to survive. Challenges to New Deal laws had already succeeded. Opponents argued that the federal government had exceeded its constitutional power. Yet by May 1937, more than 26 million Social Security numbers had been issued, and roughly $150 million had been collected. On May 24th, the Supreme Court delivered two decisions. In Helvering v. Davis, the justices upheld the old age insurance taxes by 7 votes to 2. In Stewart Machine Company v. Davis, they upheld the unemployment compensation structure by 5 votes to 4. The machinery did not have to be dismantled, but a constitutional victory did not answer the moral and practical question at the gate. The court had confirmed that Congress could build the system. It had not decided that the first coverage map was complete. The records continued to accumulate. And then the first money came out. It was 17 cents. Ernest Ackerman had spent his working life as a Cleveland motorman. He retired just as the new payroll tax system began in January 1937. According to Social Security's official history, Ackerman participated for 1 day. A nickel was withheld from his pay. Because monthly benefits were still scheduled years in the future, and he would not stay in covered employment long enough to qualify, the program did not promise him a monthly pension. It returned a lump sum. The amount was 17 cents. That tiny payment is easy to turn into a joke about government, but it reveals the original design more clearly than the signing ceremony does. From 1937 through 1939, the system issued one-time lump sums to workers who reached 65 or died before they could qualify for monthly benefits. The formula returned an amount tied to covered wages. Ackerman's 1 day of participation produced the most famous extreme. The average lump sum payment in those startup years was much larger, about $58.06. So 17 cents was not the first monthly Social Security check, and it was not a typical retirement benefit. It was the first reported payment under a system still in its waiting period. That distinction matters because the 1935 program contained a tension. It was insurance, but parts of its original benefit logic resembled an individual money-back account. A worker paid in. A worker accumulated covered wages. If the worker died before receiving monthly benefits, the connection between those contributions and the surviving family was limited. Real households did not experience retirement and death as isolated individual events. A covered worker might support a spouse who had no wage record. Children could lose income when a parent died. A widow could outlive the worker whose payroll taxes had built the account. Meanwhile, the reserve structure of the original program drew political criticism. Taxes would begin in 1937, while monthly checks waited until 1942. A large reserve would accumulate. Critics asked why the program should hold so much money, while older people needed support immediately. Supporters of a revised system argued that benefits could begin sooner, and protection should extend to families, not merely refund part of one worker's recorded wages. Ackerman's 17 cents therefore sits at the hinge of the story. It proves the machine was operating. A nickel had been collected, a wage had been recorded, a claim had been calculated, and money had been returned. Yet it also proves how far the system remained from the monthly retirement protection Americans now associate with Social Security. Congress did not wait for 1942 to discover the gap. Before the first recurring check was mailed, lawmakers rebuilt the promise. On August 10, 1939, 4 years after the original act, new amendments became law. The most visible change was a date. Monthly old age benefits had been scheduled to begin in January 1942. Congress moved the start to January 1940, 2 full years earlier. But the deeper change was the unit of protection. The 1935 program centered on the individual wage earner and that person's covered earnings. The 1939 amendments added benefits for aged wives and dependent children of retired workers. They added survivor protection for specified widows, children, and dependent parents. The account still belonged to a covered wage record. The payroll machinery still mattered, but the consequences could now branch outward from the worker to a household. This moved Social Security away from a narrow money-back logic and toward family insurance. The insured event was no longer only one person reaching retirement. It could be the loss of a breadwinner's income. A wage record could protect people whose own employment had not produced an insured account. That was a major expansion of benefits. It was not a major expansion of covered work. The original boundary remained largely in place. A domestic worker excluded in 1935 did not suddenly begin earning coverage because a covered worker's spouse could receive a benefit. A farm laborer did not enter because the monthly start date moved forward. Congress had changed what the system paid and when it paid, while leaving most of the gate intact. This is why the first recurring monthly check belongs to a different program from the one Roosevelt signed, even though both carried the same name. Ida Mae Fuller was a retired legal secretary in Ludlow, Vermont. She had worked in covered employment for just under 3 years after payroll taxes began. In November 1939, she filed for a benefit. Her claim entered the new system just as the amendments accelerated the monthly schedule. Check number 000000001 was dated January 31, 1940. It was for $22.54. Fuller was not the first person ever to receive money from Social Security. Ackerman and thousands of other lump sum recipients came before her. She was the first recurring monthly beneficiary. Her check was modest, but it proved that the revised promise had become operational. A worker's wage history had been gathered, a monthly amount calculated, and a federal payment mailed on a repeating schedule. Fuller lived to 100. Social Security's official history says she and her employer had paid a combined $24.75 in accumulated taxes during her short period of covered work, while she ultimately received more than $22,000 over her lifetime. That extraordinary early system result was created by timing and longevity. It was not investment performance, and it was not a rate of return promised to every worker. What it dramatized was risk pooling. No individual could know in advance how long retirement would last. The recurring check had arrived. The coverage problem had not been solved. The first monthly checks can make the story feel finished. The machinery worked. The Supreme Court had approved it. Congress had added family and survivor benefits. Ida Mae Fuller's check reached Vermont, but the worker on the other side of the gate still had no covered wage record. In 1940, a regularly employed domestic worker could spend the entire year earning money in private homes without adding $1 to Social Security earnings. A self-employed shopkeeper could pay bills, support a family, and grow older without entering the old age insurance system. Many farm workers moved through another season without coverage. The exclusion was especially harsh because the program was becoming more valuable. In 1935, being outside meant missing a future individual retirement benefit that would not begin until 1942. After 1939, it meant missing a program that could begin sooner and could protect spouses, children, and survivors. Political pressure for expansion grew. So did administrative capacity. The federal government learned how to process wage reports, settle claims, and maintain millions of accounts. Employers became familiar with reporting. The impossible scale of 1936 became a working bureaucracy. Yet extending coverage was not as simple as crossing out one paragraph. Farm and domestic work still posed reporting problems. Congress had to define when a domestic worker's employment was regular enough to count. Self-employed income required a different tax and reporting method from a wage paid by an employer. State and local government coverage raised questions about existing pension systems and agreements between governments. Nonprofit employees and clergy brought their own statutory rules. Expansion therefore arrived in pieces. The decisive break came with the Social Security Amendments of 1950. They extended coverage to roughly 9.8 to 10 million additional people. The new groups included many regularly employed farm and domestic workers, many non-farm self-employed people, some federal workers, workers in Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands, and groups entering through voluntary arrangements. This was not universality overnight. Domestic worker coverage came with tests for regularity and earnings. Self-employment coverage had exceptions. Some public and nonprofit participation depended on elections or agreements. Later amendments still had work to do. The 1950 law changed the size of the gate far more than it changed the machine behind it. But the scale had changed. Millions of workers whose labor had been invisible to Title II could now begin building insured records. Further expansions in 1954 and 1956 pushed coverage closer to the modern expectation. Congressional Research Service figures place the share of the workforce covered at about 86% by 1957. Social Security histories describe protection reaching roughly 90% by the mid-1950s, depending on the measure and year. The difference between 56% and nearly 9 in 10 was not a footnote. It was a transformation of what the institution meant. The system Roosevelt signed was a limited program centered on regular wages in commerce and industry. The system emerging 2 decades later was much closer to national social insurance. It kept the same central machine: identify the worker, record the earnings, collect the tax, calculate the right. What changed was which forms of work the machine was built to see. Return to the 8 workers standing at the first gate. In 1935, slightly more than 4 of them are inside the original old age insurance system. Their employers can report wages. Their work fits the statutory definition. Their pay can become a federal record. The others remain dark, not because they do not work, and not because old age will spare them, but because their labor falls into categories the new system excludes. The first answer to why is practical. A contributory program needed enforceable taxes and reliable lifetime wage records. Its designers started with employment they believed could be administered at national scale. The second answer is political. Congress accepted a narrower beginning rather than waiting for perfect coverage. Different categories carried different institutional conflicts, and the largest exclusions entered the law with little public debate. The third answer is the consequence: administrative convenience mapped onto an unequal labor market. Black workers and women were concentrated in some of the largest excluded occupations. A neutral-looking job category could reproduce the country's existing divisions in federal policy. Then the gate began to move. The government registered tens of millions of workers and survived a constitutional challenge. Ernest Ackerman's 17-cent lump sum showed the startup system doing exactly what its original rules required, and how unlike a pension those rules could look. The 1939 amendments moved monthly benefits from 1942 to 1940 and turned an individual account toward family and survivor insurance. Ida Mae Fuller's $22.54 check proved that recurring protection had begun. Still, farm laborers, domestic workers, the self-employed, and millions of others remained outside. Only the expansion of 1950, followed by further changes in the mid-1950s, brought most of them into the same record system. That is the real achievement and the real limit of the Social Security story. The program did not arrive universal and complete. It arrived as a machine with a boundary. Its durability came partly from the fact that Congress could change what the machine paid and whom it recognized. The most important object in this history is not the first check. It is not even the first Social Security card. It is the wage record behind the card. For the covered worker, each reported dollar became evidence. This person had contributed. This household could qualify. This claim had a legal basis. For the excluded worker, equally real labor produced no such evidence inside the program. By the 1950s, most of the figures at the gate have crossed. The red line recedes across fields, kitchens, shops, and government offices. It does not disappear. Thresholds and exceptions remain, and coverage will continue to change. But the line is no longer hidden inside the signing photograph. A social insurance promise is only as broad as the work its records can see. In 1935, Social Security could see barely more than half the workforce. The next 20 years were the fight to teach the machine to see the rest.